Hello there, Dr. Jack Stack again, and I'm so excited to be with you here today to talk about the history of life. And we are going to be continuing our history of life lecture. If you listened to the previous lecture, you'll know we basically focused on abiogenesis, which is the origin of life from a non-biological origin, right? Which is how do we get living things from non-living things? And I noticed my portrait is covering this up. So why don't I move my portrait up here? So that was the focus of the last lecture. Today, we're going to focus on this idea of the last universal common ancestor, which is the common ancestor of all living things, and how evolution has played out since that, right? So if you're curious about where life comes from, you can see my previous lecture, which is a brief history of life, part one. But today we're going to really start with where evolution starts, right? Because remember, evolution is change in life, right? Evolution is a fact that we observe that living things change with time, right? Populations change, species change, et cetera, et cetera. And evolution doesn't start until we have living things, right? So evolution does not deal with the origin of life. That is a question of chemistry. But now that we have discussed how we got, or at least what we know about going from non-living to living, there are tons of unanswered questions as we talked about last time. We're going to get into the history of life once life started. Now, all we think that all living things today have a common ancestor in the deep past. And let's talk about why we think that is. So this tree is showing you this idea that every living thing we have today, which is divided between bacteria, which are single-celled prokaryotic organisms, things like E. coli, for example, is a species of bacteria. Archaea, which are a group of single-celled organisms that are actually more closely related. Their genetic material is more similar to you and I than they are to other single-cell organisms. They were originally classified as bacteria, believe it or not. And then eukarya, which are organisms that have larger, more complex cells, such as you and I, and such as plants, fungi, and some other single-celled organisms, I should say, that have these larger, more complex cells. Let's go. And Luca, or last universal common ancestor, is this idea that all of the living things we see today have some common ancestor in the deep past. And if you hear some noises, my cat has decided that she needs to be in here while I'm doing this lecture. So say hi to Poppy. She's my teaching assistant for the day. She's exploring. Um, so, hi, buddy. You enjoying the lecture so far? I think she is. Anywho, let's talk about why we think this, because students ask this, and I think it's a really good question. Why do we think that all living things today had a common ancestor? Because as we discussed last time, we know that life can go from inorganic or like non-living to living. Why do we think that all the things we have today come from one origin? Well, there's a couple of really critical shared properties that even the most dissimilar living things, like you in a bacterium, right? Very, very different. But you actually share more things than you would expect. So, number one, the genetic code for living things is nearly universal. It's not entirely universal, but the thing that code, like a codon in you, a section of genetic code that codes for a specific protein or a specific amino acid, is the same across almost all organisms. Almost all organisms, some use RNA, but almost all organisms use DNA as their genetic code. And a lot of that genetic code does the same thing in very different organisms. Uh, Again, some organisms use RNA, which is very similar to DNA, but a little less complex, right? But it's not just that we have almost all have DNA, it's that the machinery for protein synthesis, which is making proteins, making the building blocks of your cells, the building blocks of an organism, are shared between organisms. So the machinery that builds the proteins in your body is very similar to the machinery that builds the proteins in a single-celled bacteria. And yeah, so this, as I mentioned before, right? We're going to get into genetics and mutation in a future lecture, but what you need to know for now is that DNA is this molecule that encodes information It has the information. It's basically like the blueprint or the recipe for making you, right? It's in all of your cells, and it's basically like this little reference sheet. And they open it up and say, oh, okay, this is how we make this protein. All right, good, right? That's basically what's going on. That machinery is really similar between very different organisms. So that's the major piece of evidence that suggests that we all have a universal common ancestor. Even things that don't have to be the same. Like there are some codons, like there are some basically there are codons that code for like one thing, but there's other things that can code for that, and we still share it across pretty much all organisms. Unfortunately, the chances of actually finding a fossil of the actual universal common ancestor, like the actual thing, is pretty much zero, which is the same for basically trying to find the one animal or like the one organism is literally imagine, right? You're trying to find a needle in a haystack that is over 3.5 billion hay bales tall, right? Pretty much impossible. But we can use the shared characteristics of living things to try to understand what the universal common ancestor looked like. And there are whole labs and fields of research that are devoted to trying to understand the universal common ancestor of living things. Right. And so, yeah, this is like a major area of research. So, this is something that if you're interested in science, this is something you can get into, especially if you're interested in the like chemical side of biology. This is a good area for you. And again, this doesn't mean that living things only originated one time. There may have been many origins of living things. What it means is that the living things that have descendants that reach to the present all have one universal common ancestor. I would not be shocked if there were multiple origins of life on Earth, but one lineage, one out, and represents life throughout the rest of the fossil record. That is conjecture, I should say. There's not direct evidence of that, but it would not shock me if there were multiple origins of life on Earth. As we discussed before, it's not easy to make living things from non-living things. It's very complex, but it's not impossible, as we have learned. Now, there's a huge issue here, and I've brought up the fossil record before. And as we go through this lecture, essentially, we're going to get more and more information from the fossil record as we move closer to the present day. The issue is, and I found a really interesting paper that calls this the pseudo fossil problem, which is essentially the older the rock is, the harder it is to determine that something is actually a fossil versus an altered component of something else, right? An organic molecule that has been altered or heated or twisted to look like a fossil, essentially. So if you're not familiar, the word pseudo in this context means false. If you've heard the word pseudonym, like a false name, a fake name, it means the same thing. A pseudo fossil is a fake fossil. And importantly, a pseudo fossil is not something that a person makes. Like there are people who make fake fossils and try to sell them. That's not what a pseudo fossil is. A pseudo fossil is a non-organic process that creates something that looks like a remain of a living animal. And this becomes a major problem when we're talking about rocks that are over 3 billion years old. So we have in this system, right, in the Archean Ocean, right, over 3 billion years ago, essentially they say, okay, we have protein synthesis going on, right? We have organic chemistry happening. And we learned in our lecture on abiogenesis that you can get organic molecules from inorganic processes, right? That's still going on. You also have early life, you have living things. The issue is when you take those two things and mix them together in the rock record, you get this kind of mixture of things that could be living, like not animals at this point, but pieces of cells, pieces of organisms. And you have things that could just be in or non-living organic chemistry, essentially. And when rocks are billions of years old, it's very hard to tell this apart. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, always remember Earth history is a destructive process. Earth is always moving, always changing. Rocks are always being destroyed constantly. As we're talking right now, there are rocks that are being melted, there are rocks that are being eroded, rocks that are being crushed by ice, broken apart by plant roots, right? Dug by animals, right? All of these things are happening all the time. So the older a rock is, or is, if a rock exists for a longer period of time, it's more likely to be destroyed, essentially. So after 3 billion years, we don't have that many rocks from the Archean, right? We talked about the oldest rocks on Earth are like these detrital zircons from the Hadean. We have more Archean rocks, but they are less common than the rocks from earlier time periods. And the chance that the rock is going to be unaltered, that is, that nothing is going to alter the rock to make it look like you have a fossil when you really don't, are very low. So essentially, Earth history is not our friend here. Earth history alters and destroys Earth history. It destroys rocks, it destroys fossils, which means that the farther back in time you go, the harder the job of the paleontologist and the chemist become. You have more, and this is the same problem if you're studying human history. There are a lot more books and papers and records of the year 2025, last year, than 2000 BC, right? There's just as time passes, things are more likely to get destroyed or altered. So the older the rock is, the higher the chance of something called metamorphosis, which is when a rock is heated and subjected to pressure and otherwise changed, essentially, which destroys or alters fossils and can take an organic compound and make it look like a fossil. It can make it look like bacteria when it really is an or inorganic process of abiotic chemistry, I should say. So the oldest potential life is actually a highly contested topic. You will get different answers depending on who you talk to, because there are, and as I was making this lecture, there are several contested sets of basically rocks that look like they have fossils to some people, and other people argue the opposite, essentially. And as we go, there's going to be controversy around some of these things. You will find some researchers who will argue that life originated like 4 billion years ago, it's 3.7, 3.8. These are not because we're so uncertain, people are just making up numbers. Is that there are different actual fossils or potential fossils that people argue about, and it is part of the scientific process, right? Any fossil can be falsified. Any fossil can be proven to be a pseudofossil. It becomes harder to distinguish pseudofossils from real fossils the older you get, essentially. The oldest uncontroversial life on Earth is from the Archean, though. There are uncontroversial fossils like this that show these very distinct layers, and we're going to talk about what these are. But there are remains of Archean life, and the Archean is 4 billion to 2.5 billion years ago. I have seen some debate about what are the oldest uncontroversial fossils. The record that I'm getting is about 3.5 billion years old, or billion years ago, is when we start to get fossils that are uncontroversial. And these fossils take the form of something called a stromatolite. And a stromatolite essentially is a mat forming microorganism. So you have all of these little single celled organisms that form a mat. And what happens is sediment sticks to the mat, and then the microorganisms make another layer, and then sediment sticks to it, and you get this layer by layer by layer by layer. And since sediment is incorporated into it, it's essentially this organically forming sedimentary rock that is more easily preserved than soft-bodied microorganisms. Because remember, at this point in the history of life, we don't have any bones or teeth or shells or seeds, these other things that are a much more common component of the fossil record. These things do not exist yet. So stromatolites are some of the best evidence we have for this early life. And so stromatolites form the earliest definitive fossils. This is so like the fossil we have here. I forget. I think this is from Australia. Um, but fossils like this is definitively a living thing. Life probably originated much earlier than this, but we don't like the chances of finding uncontroversial fossils from say 4 billion years ago is very, very low. Not impossible, but very, very low. So the oldest confirmed stromatolites, excuse me, the oldest uncontroversial evidence of living things, like direct evidence, fossils, are 3.4 billion years old. Almost certainly life existed before then. But this, if you're looking for, if you're someone like me, and you like to have your feet on solid ground when you're constructing an argument, when you're thinking, then 3.4 billion years old is a very safe date for the oldest life on Earth. I would tell you there's definitely life before that, but not direct evidence for it, at least in the form of fossils. And this, we might wonder, well, how do we know that that's a stromatolite when we find the fossil? How can we be sure? The good news here is that stromatolites still exist. You can go see stromatolites. So this is a very famous picture. This is Shark Bay in Australia on the left, where stromatolites still live. They're not nearly as common as they were in the Archean. My understanding is that they fall prey to things like snails and stuff a lot, but they exist in very hypersaline water. But and let me move my portrait here for a second so you can see. So here we have our Moody's group. These are 3.2 billion year old stromatolites, I believe from Australia. I think Moody's is in Australia. And then on the right, we have modern cyanobacterial mats. So these organisms still exist today. They have been around for billions of years. The fossil evidence suggests that these were the most common form of life in the Archean, probably the most common form of life for a billion and a half years, like three times the amount of time that there's been large multicellular animals like us running around. So if you think about it, stromatolites, in terms of time, in terms of the amount of time that they've existed, are the most successful form, at least of like macroscopic life, of something you can see with your eyes. Oh, apologies. And you can see there are these structures essentially that form from cyanobacterial mats that are distinctive from what we call sedimentary processes, like abiotic sedimentary processes. That is, things that are forming purely from non-living sedimentary rocks. Let's take a look here. Oh, yeah, yeah. So, for most of the history of the Earth, life has been single celled. The advent of large multicellular organisms is a very new thing in the history of life. In between about 4 billion to 1 billion years ago, there's only single celled organisms, we think. So there's billions of years where life is single celled. And there's a complication here because there's this tendency to think of all single celled organisms as being the same, right? Because they're all small, they're all relatively simple compared to us. But what we've learned, especially in the last 50 years, is a lot of these single-celled organisms are very different from each other. So I forgot to put some of the animations here. My bad on that. But all of these pictures that we have in the center of the screen, all single-celled organisms, none of them are bacteria. They are all part of this group called the archaea that we'll meet here in a minute. But before we get into that, I think it's important to talk about the cell and how we define different types of life based on cells. So, what we've known since we started looking at smaller living things is that the fundamental unit of life is the cell, right? These things like bacteria are the simplest form of life that we find. There are these self contained individuals where there is homeostasis, there's this maintained physical and chemical environment that is doing the processes of life, right? They are reproducing, they are responding to the outside world, they are moving, right? All of these things that make something alive. So this is a bacterium, and you can see that the DNA is basically coiled up inside of the cell. And of course, we have things like flagella and things like cilia. We have structures, we have moving around, responding to the environment. A bacterium is simpler than you are, but it is a living thing. It matches, or it has all of these characteristics of living things, just like you and I. Now, animals and plants have larger and more complex cells than things like bacteria. So, for example, in animals and plants, you have these things called organelles. So part of the reason that you can be a multicellular organism, you can have all of these cells that are essentially working together to be you. Say thank you to all your cells, right? Thank you, cells, for all the hard work you do. Part of the reason you can do this is that these cells are larger and have lots of these more complex components that do specialized functions. So let me give you an example. Your body has a bunch of specialized components that do different things for you. For example, you have a brain that is the command center of your body, right? It's contained within your skull. You have your heart, your lungs, your stomach, right? These are called organs. In your cells, you have these contained specialized areas that do specialized things for your cell called organelles. For example, your cells have something called mitochondria. Mitochondria are organelles that create essentially a molecular form of energy currency between your cells called adenosine triphosphate. This is why the mitochondria are also called the powerhouse of the cell, if you've heard that turn of phrase. So our cells are larger and more complex than bacterial cells. They are both fundamental units of life. The difference between you and a bacterium is that you have many cells working together rather than one cell being alive on its own. The difference between animal and plant cells is they have these things called chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are also producing energy through this process called photosynthesis. Plants also have mitochondria, by the way. Plants also have something called a cell wall, which is this wall around the cell that protects them. And there's a lot of bacteria that have cell walls as well, is my understanding. So early on, when we're studying the history of life, and if I'd given you a lecture on the history of biology rather than evolutionary biology, we would have talked a little bit more about this. But essentially, we've recognized for well over a century that there is a fundamental distinction between living things that are composed of these simple single-celled organisms versus more complex multicellular or also called eukaryotic organisms. So early on, and you would have learned this up until like the 1950s and 60s, you learn that cells come in these two basic forms. You have your prokaryote, your bacterial type cells, where you essentially have all your DNA. So, this is a little out of order. Let me start over. You have your eukaryotic cells, where you have a nucleus that contains the DNA, and you have these specialized organelles that perform the functions of the cell. So you have things like mitochondria, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, right? These things that are doing all of these specialized functions that have these little mini microenvironments inside of the cell itself that do the specialized functions of the cell. Whereas your prokaryotic cells are smaller, they do not have a nucleus, their DNA is just sort of coiled up in there, and they don't have these organelles. Simple, right? It'd be really easy if we could say, okay, life is divided between eukaryote, prokaryote, boom, we're done. Well, unfortunately, it's actually a lot harder than that, and it's a lot more complex. And it's interesting, before the advent of genetic research, there was essentially like this century of trying to unravel the evolutionary history of bacteria and single-celled organisms that was really hitting a dead end. There was this before you had genetic research, like trying to classify all of these single-celled organisms based on their morphology. It's very, very difficult. And I found this quote that I thought was interesting. This is by an expert at the time in bacterial evolution who said, any good biologist finds it intellectually distressing to devote his life to the study of a group that cannot be readily and satisfactorily defined. So this is part of the issue. You can say, okay, we have prokaryotes, but things get more complex. As you learn more about them, there's more complexity. And there's all of this variation in prokaryotes. They live in radically different environments. They have radically different morphologies. There's all of this variation, but it's very difficult to parse it in a satisfactory and scientifically reliable way without this thing we now call genetic data. And the study of the genetic information in these organisms is so powerful because if you go back here, you'll see, even though we are very different from prokaryotes, and prokaryotes will look very different from each other, they all have DNA. So the fact that there is this shared genetic code doesn't just tell us that all living things have a universal common ancestor. It is a way to compare them. You can compare a prokaryote to a person because they both have genetic information and they have this shared genetic code that we can use as a source of information. And essentially, when we started studying the genetics of these animals, we really started to learn something about them, which is that a lot of these things that we called bacteria were actually not bacteria. They're not closely related to bacteria. They're more closely related to you and I than they are to other single-celled organisms. And a lot of these single-celled organisms come from a very extreme environment. So when I say extreme, I mean they're environments that are typically hard to survive in, environments that are really hot, environments that are rich in methane and salt, which is why a lot of these organisms have the word "phile" in their name. So they'll say something like methanophile, meaning that they like methane. Halophile, they like salt. Thermophile, they like heat. These very distinctive single-celled organisms that are found in these extreme environments. And what we learned is that they are very distinct from bacteria. They are more similar to you and I than they are to bacteria, but they form this essentially separate domain of life that we call archaea. So this in the 1970s, Carl Woese, and I forget the first name of Fox, but basically in 1977, they demonstrate how the DNA sequence in these organisms can be used to reconstruct evolutionary history. Very, very important for today, right? The genetic revolution and the use of genetics to reconstruct evolutionary history continues. There's actually a very interesting paper in preprint right now that is trying to basically put out genomes for every major group of life and build an evolutionary tree with that, which I think is very interesting. I'm looking forward to reading that. But basically, this paper shows that there is this other domain of living things. It's not just bacteria and or prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotes include this very, very distinct group of living things. This is a radical rewriting of the history of life. This is a shift in a paradigm that had existed for like 100 years at this point, because people had observed bacteria, and like bacteria, eukaryotes, different, right? We have these two sets of life, perfect. Not correct. Life is more complicated than that. So these archaea, and they're a very interesting area of research. We're starting to learn, or something that I've learned since reading more about them, is that they do seem to do well in these extreme environments, but they're not necessarily limited to them. So we find them in these really extreme environments, like hot, like geysers and hot springs, like in mine runoff and things like that. But they may not actually be limited to them to the extent that we thought before, which I think is fascinating. Anywho, this brings us to essentially the idea of the history of life that we have today. So today we think that life is divided between these three domains: bacteria, things like E. coli; archaea, things like I noticed are uh, halophiles, right? Lover of heat, archaea; and eukarya, which includes animals, plants, fungi, slime molds, things of that nature, right? Including some single-celled organisms that have larger and more complex cells than our bacteria. I will say I would not be surprised if in the next 10 years, with more genetic research, if we figure out that what we call bacteria today includes multiple domains of its own. I personally think that, and from my limited reading, the study of bacterial evolution is still very much a challenge. Partly, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we can't actually grow most bacteria in the lab, which makes it very, very difficult to study them. If you're looking for a difficult but very rewarding and very important area of research, I'd say bacterial evolution would be a good candidate for you. They have bacteria, archaea, eukarya. So how did we get here? How did we get to basically this set of living things, right? All of these different living things, how did we get here? Well, what we've learned is that we have bacteria, which are this giant grouping of single-celled prokaryotic organisms. Most of them are very poorly known. Most bacteria we have not been able to grow in the lab. It's a huge problem. Most bacteria cannot be like you've seen maybe in movies, right? The person is looking at the microscope and they see the bacteria under the microscope. Most bacteria, you can't do that. Most of them will not grow in the lab like this. We actually know we know a lot, but there's so much complexity here. There's so much to know, and we have a lot to learn about these things. I would guess, I would predict that they include more than one domain. I predict that if you take this class 50 years from now, you will learn that there's like three or four domains in what we call bacteria. And it's probably going to get a lot more complex. For now, we're going to treat them as one thing, right? We can't just say, oh, they're multiple domains because they probably are. No, we need evidence for that. And that's where all that genetic research comes in. But it's, again, very challenging to do. And they're essentially ubiquitous. Like bacteria are everywhere, right? They're on the surface. They're probably on my forehead, right? They're everywhere. Most of them, by the way, are not disease-causing agents. That's important to know, right? The vast majority of bacteria do not cause disease. A lot of them are actually very important. You may have heard of your microbiome, right? So some of them are actually involved in a mutualistic interaction, which if you've taken zoology from me, you know mutualism is when two organisms provide fitness benefits to each other. So bacteria should not be synonymous with disease. There are bacteria that cause disease, and you should wash your hands because there are, but most bacteria we know very little about. And most bacteria probably have a neutral effect on your health. Unfortunately, there are plenty that will cause poor effects on your health, and so you should definitely wash your hands. And I made this meme, it's kind of a dumb joke. If you've watched Planet of the Apes, you'll know this is the scene where the main character is riding along the beach and he realizes that the planet is Earth and that this is the planet that humans used to rule, but now it's Planet of the Apes. I think that if stromatolites were capable, they would find these fossils and realize this is the world that we used to rule 3 billion years ago. For over 1 billion years, the main component of the fossil record are stromatolites. These microbial mats were the dominant form of life on Earth for multiple times longer than dinosaurs exist for many, many multiple times, right? Dinosaurs were really successful for over 100 million years. 100 million years is 10% of 1 billion years. These things were around and were dominant for like 1.5 billion years. Right? And essentially the Archean, again, 4 to what was it, 2.5 billion years ago, is this world of microbes. I call it the planet of the microbes. Very little atmospheric oxygen, this very successful radiation of basically bacterial mats that are doing very well. Now, what we're going to learn is in the Proterozoic, which is bringing us closer to the present, 2.5 billion to 538 million years ago, we're going to see some very radical shifts in the Earth and life system. Remember, we talked about the Hadean and the origin of life. I told you that the atmosphere of the Earth's past is very different than today. And we're going to learn how Earth's atmosphere got to where it is. The atmosphere we have today would be completely alien to a living thing from 3.5 billion years ago. If you were to go back in time to 3.2 billion years ago to try to look at this stromatolite, you would die. You would asphyxiate in Earth's atmosphere because oxygen is not an original component, or sorry, free oxygen is not an original component of the Earth's atmosphere. If you went to Michigan State University like I did for my master's, you have seen fossils like this. This is also very common in Michigan and Australia. If you're from the Northern Peninsula, especially the iron mining parts of the Northern Peninsula, you may be familiar with something called banded iron formation. Banded iron formations are this beautiful, beautiful, it's not technically a fossil, but a beautiful, beautiful type of rock that can no longer form in Earth's atmosphere. Banded iron formations indicate to us that photosynthesis originated in the Archean. But let me explain. A banded iron formation is so pretty because it has these red and silver lines. It's iron, which makes it very economically important, right? Places like Iron Mountain in northern Michigan, Negaunee, places like that depend on this iron and have been iron mining communities for a long time. But you have these silver, red, silver, red, silver, red, silver, red. And it makes it very pretty. And it also shows us that at the time this formed, free oxygen was not a normal component of the Earth's atmosphere. Let me ask you, if you leave something that is made of metal, specifically something that is made of steel or iron, you leave it out for a long time, what happens to it? It rusts, right? I've seen lots of rusty metal. It's a hazard, right? Because there's bacteria that grows on there that can get you very sick. Rusty metal is a consequence of something called oxygenation, or sorry, oxygenation, oxidization. It becomes oxidized, right? It reacts, the iron reacts with the oxygen to make iron oxide, right? Which is also called rust. And that has that reddish color that you see in some layers of this rock. That's oxidized. The silvery layers were not oxidized when it formed. You can't form that today. There's too much free oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. You could not form something like this. What happened is that you have living things that are photosynthesizing, they're putting oxygen out into the atmosphere, and it's getting absorbed by the rock. It's getting oxidized to create the red layer. Those living things die, they use up all the carbon dioxide and die, right? And then you have a period of time where there's no oxygen in the atmosphere. So you get this silver layer deposited. And then the living things come back and oxygen being produced again, because oxygen, remember, is a byproduct of photosynthesis, right? So essentially, you can't form banded iron today. You can't have a situation where the only oxygen in an area is coming from photosynthesis because the Earth's atmosphere is full of oxygen, right? There's tons of free oxygen. I'm breathing it right now, right? You fly across the world somewhere else, there's free oxygen in the air, right? It is ubiquitous almost in Earth's atmosphere. It was not in the Archean. And banded iron formations are part of the evidence we have for this. So free oxygen, also called O2, where it's two oxygen molecules, is the byproduct of photosynthesis in Earth's atmosphere. So you have photosynthesizing organisms like our cyanobacteria that are putting out oxygen into the atmosphere. Now, as you can imagine, a bacterial mat doesn't put out a ton of oxygen, right? It's a byproduct of photosynthesis. It puts out some, we get these banded iron formations. But for well over 1 billion years, oxygen is absorbed by these mineral sinks. There are these natural sinks for oxygen where you have oxidization happening and you have oxygen being basically absorbed, being taken out of the atmosphere. It's reacting with iron. But what happens? Oh yeah, this has been people have been mining these for iron for thousands of years, which I think is cool. But essentially, what happens is something called the Great Oxidation Event, where you have essentially all of this oxygen going into the atmosphere, and for millions of years, it's absorbed by mineral sinks. But about 2.3 billion years ago, the mineral sinks run out, right? It took 1 billion years, but all that oxygen that is getting absorbed suddenly, or not really suddenly, but essentially you run out of natural sinks, right? And there's more oxygen being put into the atmosphere than is being taken out. So over about a 10 million year interval, we see this massive increase in atmospheric oxygen as sourced from photosynthesis. And what's fascinating about this is today, right, when I say oxygen, you probably have positive thoughts because you need air to breathe. We require oxygen to live. But at this period of time, oxygen is purely a metabolic byproduct, essentially a waste product in the atmosphere. So we think that there would have been a mass extinction of organisms that cannot live with oxygen. There are organisms where oxygen is actually a metabolic poison for them. If exposed to oxygen, they will die. And those types of organisms we think were much more common before the atmosphere became oxygenated. So it's this fascinating period in the history of life where essentially we have this mass extinction caused by the byproduct of life. Life is putting off oxygen for 1 billion years. Things are fine, right? Because the oxygen gets absorbed. And then after that, there's all this oxygen still going into the atmosphere. It's not getting oxidized. A lot of organisms went extinct. We think that there would have been a mass extinction at this period of time of anaerobic organisms that cannot survive when oxygen is around them. And they think that those went extinct. So that's we think is probably the first mass extinction in the history of life. At least we theorize that this is the first, the oldest one that we have like good evidence for, right? We see this massive change in Earth's atmosphere. Now, today, almost all living things actually use oxygen in respiration. And the reason for this is oxygen is everywhere. It's a massive byproduct of plant life. And it's this interesting way we tend to center ourselves, right? And I am just as guilty of this as anybody else. But we tend to center ourselves when we talk about history and like where do I fit into history? But if you think about it, we're kind of a byproduct of plant history or photosynthetic organism history. We don't really have plants the way we think of plants today at this period of time. Us aerobic organisms, oxygen that you or animals that use oxygen, right? We produce, I mentioned that adenosine triphosphate earlier, that's produced via oxidation. That's that universal energy currency between our cells. The only reason we can do that is because there's all this oxygen in the atmosphere around us produced by photosynthesis. So we are the descendants of organisms that essentially adapted to live in this poisoned atmosphere. It's strange to think about, but oxygen is a corrosive metabolic poison to the organisms that existed up until about 2.3 billion years ago. Most of them are extinct, and we are basically we adapted to be able to use oxygen in our respiration. It's very weird to think about. Now, our byproducts of our respiration are carbon dioxide and water, which are, of course, needed for photosynthesis. So we and photosynthetic organisms kind of have this mutualistic interaction, right? They use carbon dioxide to produce oxygen. We use oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and go back and forth. So we need photosynthetic organisms just as much as they need us. But there's this interesting argument, and I think it's correct, that photosynthetic organisms essentially terraformed the Earth, if you think about it. Billion years, they transformed the atmosphere of the Earth, basically pushed a bunch of other organisms to extinction, thus creating more space for themselves. And the organisms that were able to adapt produce what they need as a byproduct. So, and I'm not saying that plants did this on purpose, right? I'm not saying that these photosynthetic bacteria are, having machinations, but you could argue that this is a terraforming of the earth. It's a radical change in life that happened about 2.3 billion years ago, right? And remember before that's like there's like a billion year history of life before that. So this is a very, very radical change that I think a lot of people don't know about. We think about our present conditions as having been, what the earth has been like, but there's a billion year history of life, which is twice as long as the history of large multicellular organisms that is of a oxygen or oxygen-free atmosphere. Almost all those organisms went extinct. Sad to think about. But what I want you to take away from this slide, besides the plants being kind of terrifying, is that the living and non-living systems do influence each other. And when we're talking about evolution and evolutionary history, we must always think about that we cannot understand living things in isolation. Living things exist in the Earth system. They exist in a system that includes living and non-living processes that influence each other. Organisms influence their environment, the environment influences them, right? It's very, very important to understand that this is the first and one of the most radical examples of that. But it's very important to understand that we influence the earth, earth influences us. So I have seen it argued, and I actually agree with this argument, that the origin of eukaryotic cell, the origin of cells that are large, complex, and have organelles is a larger leap, a more complex leap than the origin of life. There are people who disagree with that, but we tend to think of the origin of life as this almost magical thing. But what we've learned is that it's actually not that, like chemically speaking, yes, it is complex, but to go from non-living to self-replicating, like nucleotides, essentially self-replicating molecules, which is like the earliest thing that you could kind of define as alive, it's not all that complex. Getting to a cell is more complex. But going from single-celled organism that is very simple, something like a bacteria or bacterium, excuse me, to a eukaryotic cell. is an enormous leap. This is the difference between like an individual organism and like a city. Because you think about your cell, or your cells, excuse me, are enormously complex. Each of your cells is essentially an organism in and of itself. And it took a lot longer. The or we know that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. We know that the earliest unequivocal evidence of life is 3.2 billion years old. So that would be 1.3 billion years old, or 1.3 billion years to get life. Life definitely existed before 3.2, probably 3.5. So it took probably about a billion years, probably less, for living things to originate. Almost certainly less. We think that living things were probably around by about 4 billion years ago. So it might have taken even 500 million years for living things to originate. We know that eukaryotic organisms were not around before about 2 billion years ago. So it may have taken 2 billion years. That's billion with a B. It's an enormous amount of time to go from prokaryotic to eukaryotic organisms, longer than it took for the origin of life itself. Again, I would argue, and we're going to talk about it, but I would argue that this is a much more challenging thing to do. It's a much larger increase in complexity. And remember, the natural system, right, reducing entropy, like the system is always trying to go towards more entropy, right? That's where it's going. We increase entropy in the universe. So increasing complexity is a hard thing to do. It's not easy. It is not simple. We're going to talk about this. So the origin of our organelles, I think, is one of the most fascinating things I've ever learned in biology. We actually think that a lot of our organelles, including our mitochondria, are actually the descendants of prokaryotic organisms that became fused with other cells. We think that eukaryotic organisms are essentially an ancient archaea, like the single cell archaea organism that fused with ancient bacteria to become a new type of creature, essentially. And the evidence for this is that there are components of your cells that have their own DNA. So your cell's DNA is in its nucleus. That is the DNA that makes you. Your mitochondria have their own DNA, and that DNA makes other mitochondria, right? So your mitochondrial DNA, which by the way is inherited from your mother, you get your mitochondria from your mother, um, suggests and strongly suggests that mitochondria were once their own type of organism, and their DNA actually closely resembles bacterial DNA. So we think that mitochondria and probably other components of our cells, but definitely mitochondria, are the descendants of ancient bacteria. So we think that our like earliest cellular ancestors essentially consumed and formed a symbiotic relationship with bacteria. So there are components of your cell, the powerhouses of your cells are in some sense their own independent organisms. They have their own DNA, they have their own genetic code, but they're so ingrained within us, so ingrained within our cells for billions of years that they're essential to our life and they are part of us. Just this interesting this lecture on the origin of life kind of can create almost a philosophical crisis. Like, what does it mean to be me, right? You're all these cells working together, and your cells themselves have little components that are basically their own type of organism that have just become so ingrained. Like the mitochondria depend on your cell to keep them alive and to protect them, right? But they produce energy that everything else in your body depends upon. I just think this is fascinating. I also tracked down, I was curious about the history of this phrase, powerhouse of the cell, which has become a meme, so all my students know it. It's actually from a 1957 Scientific American article. I thought it was interesting. So if you've ever wondered where this comes from a name named Philip Siekowitz of the history of science. Also, so that's our cells, but the chloroplasts of plant cells actually really closely resemble a photosynthetic cyanobacteria. Remember, we talked about those stromatolites, which are these cyanobacterial mats. So if you compare a chloroplast on the left, which is a component of a plant cell, to a single-celled photosynthesizing organism on the right called a cyanobacteria, they're actually pretty similar. So the evidence suggests that multiple components of eukaryotic cells at definitely mitochondria and chloroplasts. Those are uncontroversial, right? But probably other components of our cells as well are the descendants of bacteria that were incorporated within our like protocells, essentially. And in plants, the main thing that makes plants different from other eukaryotes is that they have basically another organelle that became incorporated within them. Plants are so what we call plants. And earlier I was calling cyanobacteria plants. That's a mistake on my part. I know there's probably a botanist who's watching this who wants to throw fruit at the screen. Cyanobacteria are photosynthesizing bacteria. A plant is a eukaryotic organism that has essentially captured cyanobacteria and is having them do photosynthesis for it. A little terrifying. So, eukaryotes are essentially the descendants of coalesced prokaryotes. So, we have prokaryotic cells that are coming together and forming this new, larger, and more complex, essentially superorganism, right? Where we have our DNA and we have our organelles. I'm not, I'm not as educated on this as I would like to be. I'm sure that there are other organelles that we think are also descendant from other bacteria, but our mitochondria and the rest of our cell are probably the descendants of a prokaryote like a bacteria and a prokaryote like an archaea fusing together, like a large archaea with a little bacteria gets incorporated, like, okay, we can work together now. And depending on your disposition, I've seen some people liken this to stuff I'm not gonna say kind of weirdly. It's important not to make trying to make any kind of weird political statements about this, right? These are single-celled, non-thinking organisms. There's not anything nefarious actually going on here. So, getting back to the fossil record, the oldest eukaryotes that we have fossils of are about 1.6 billion years old. They would have originated before this because these eukaryotes that we're finding are things like red algae, right? They are microscopic plants, essentially, is most of what we find here. It's difficult to identify them beyond eukaryote. They're larger, more complex, have organelles, but what kind, we're not sure. But they essentially become a common component of the fossil record between 1 billion years old or 1 billion years ago and 538 million years ago. So we have some very old, oh, excuse me, switching microphones. Uh, there we go. Um, and I'm using this because I'm sitting back. So I wanted to be comfortable while I record this lecture. But essentially, our eukaryotes become a common component of the fossil record between 1 billion and 538 billion years ago, or million, yeah, million years ago. Million years, billion years ago. There we go. So the animal, or sorry, the fossil in the center is called Bangiomorpha. It's a fossil red algae. This is the oldest sexually reproducing organism we have fossil record of. So the origin of sexual reproduction is much older than things like genitals or urogenital system. Sexual reproduction has existed for well over probably like a billion years, which is fascinating. There is a lot of dispute and there's a lot of trying to think of the word uncertainty around the timing and sequence of what's called eukaryogenesis. Right? We're talking about abiogenesis, which is the origin of life. Eukaryogenesis is the origin of eukaryotes. It is now widely agreed that eukaryotic like organelles are the descendants of, or are basically the fusion of multiple prokaryotic organisms. But the sequence in which that happened, which of our organelles are derived from prokaryotes, what type of prokaryotes they came from, when this happened, this is a very active area of research. For the same reason we talked about before, the fossil record is, especially before a billion years ago, it's hard to find fossils of these things. And the fossils are small, and people have competing ideas about what they represent. Very active area of science. But today I really want to focus, the rest of the lecture is kind of going to focus on big events in the history of life, if you will. These like major changes in the history of life. So There's this fascinating period of Earth history between 720 and 635 million years ago, where we have very strong evidence that pretty much the whole Earth was covered with glaciers. The nice thing about glaciers is that they leave a very distinctive geologic record, a giant pile of ice that's a mile tall leaves a very different geologic signature than anything else. So there are very distinctive markers of glaciers. And if you're, well, I'm from Michigan, so I'm used to glacial geology. There are these very distinctive glaciers. So, for example, I grew up in a small kind of rural area. And you'll notice if you go to a place like that in Michigan, center of the mitten in Michigan, you'll notice a lot of people have big rocks in their yards. They'll have big rocks in their yards. A lot of farmers will have a big pile of rocks outside of their field. And you might wonder, man, do these people just really like rocks? Like my parents have a rock that's the size of, I think it's about the size of, eh, you can fit like maybe two or three of those rocks in this room. It's very large. It's bigger than I am. Did they just really like rocks? No. What those are glacial erratics. They are boulders that were carried by a glacier and eventually dropped there, which is why you have these giant boulders all around Michigan. And once you know to recognize that, you'll say, like, oh, there's all these big rocks everywhere. Why is that? Because of glaciers. People didn't truck in a giant piece of rock to just put in their yard. It was found during construction and moved out of the way, essentially. So this is the probably the most severe, what we call an ice house or an ice age in Earth's history. We think that during the cryogenian, that the whole Earth was covered with glaciers. The exact extent is not known, but we find glacial signatures on each of the major continents during this time. And essentially, we think that this is the opposite of what scientists think is happening today. If you're not familiar, we essentially think that things like agriculture, industrial or industry, cars, stuff like that, is putting CO2 into the atmosphere. And CO2 has this greenhouse effect, essentially. It causes more heat to be trapped, and global temperature is going up. That's called climate change or global warming. We actually think the opposite happened in the cryogenian, where we have low atmospheric CO2, and it causes this runaway problem where you have lower temperatures, which causes more ice, and ice reflects heat. It reflects solar radiation back into space. So ice actually causes things to be colder. So you get more and more ice, which is killing photosynthetic animals, which are, which wait, they use CO2, excuse me, which is killing organisms that use oxygen and produce CO2, right? Excuse me, killing those organisms. And you have more solar radiation being reflected, and that is making things colder. So we think this basically runaway 100 million, almost like 100 million year period of essentially the whole Earth being covered with ice. And this is called the ice house. Uh, we Life probably persisted because we think there were probably like pockets, essentially little areas where life was able to persist. And the life we have today is most likely descendant of those living things that managed to live on in these small pockets that weren't covered with ice. We do have like new life forms emerging. Apparently, things like predatory plankton, like we're starting to get not actual organisms, but like more complex organisms emerging. But really, the fossil record after the cryogenian is when we start to see actual animal fossils. Before the cryogenian, you're getting single-celled organisms primarily. You have some more complex organisms like eukaryotes, but after the cryogenian is when we start to see essentially what we call in biology a radiation of animals. So the reason that this is called the Ediacaran period is that paleontologists working in the Ediacara Hills of Australia discovered this very ancient and alien assemblage of fossils that we call the Ediacara assemblage. There are now, my understanding is there are dozens of sites around the world now that have these very strange animals. And I've had this picture up on the screen for about 30 seconds now. You might be wondering, Jack, what the frick is that? Is that a jellyfish? No, it's not a jellyfish. We don't know what that is, really. It has a name, right? but we don't actually know what type of animal most of these things are. The Ediacaran biota is very distinctive, and I'll show some pictures. They're definitely large multicellular organisms. Most of them are probably animals. Some of them are plants, some of them are fungi, but we don't really know what most of them are. Most of them look like this. It's definitely an organism. It's a large multicellular organism. It has a structure to it, but most of them would have been soft-bodied and probably living, we think, on these like microbial mats. So those cyanobacteria, right, are making these mats which are holding sediment, and we have these organisms that are adapted to live on these mats. They're not digging into the sediment, they're not eating each other, but they're these little, probably absorbing stuff from, or they're called sessile osmotrophs, excuse me, that are like absorbing nutrients from the basically the water around them. And yeah, I mentioned the Ediacara range of the Flinders Mountains. There's a lot of morphological diversity in these organisms. There's a bunch of different forms. I've worked with people like at Virginia Tech who work on these. There's a ton of fascinating diversity here. Huge area of research is studying these Ediacaran organisms. We now think that most of them would have lived like fixed in place. Some of them are moving around, absorbing nutrients from the environment. But notably, we don't see strong evidence of predation. We don't think these organisms are eating each other. We don't see mouth parts and teeth and spikes and shells and things like this. If you went, so if I go outside right now, I could probably find a predatory organism pretty quickly. I don't see any birds, but birds are eating bugs. Bugs are eating each other. They're eating smaller organisms, so on and so forth. So today we have this system where we have lots of things consuming each other. In the Ediacaran, not as much. Probably with some, but we don't see strong evidence of things like predators. We see a lot of basically would have been soft-bodied, absorbing organisms living on these microbial mats. And there's an enormous diversity of them. Most of these don't seem to have any living descendants. There are exceptions to that, but they're mostly called these like frond organisms. They're pretty, they kind of look like plants. Some of them get pretty big. They're not small, but they don't really look like anything we have around today. They're very distinct from the organisms we have today, mostly. And they would have formed these beautiful, probably very peaceful basically faunas that would have been around for tens of millions of years on these microbial mat communities, essentially. Now, something we have to keep in mind is that just because these are the primary fossils we find from this period doesn't mean that these are the only organisms that were around. This is what we find, but it's possible that that these environments are the only ones that were producing basically fossils. So keep that in mind. But from what we know, the Ediacaran is this period of larger, more complex organisms that are primarily not part of the groups we have today. Mostly these probably like you have not quite filter feeding, but osmotically feeding organisms. So what happened to them? You might wonder. You don't see almost all of these organisms have no living descendants. Well, we think that the environment radically changed and that these organisms would have gone extinct from a very interesting change. So a lot more people, very few people are familiar with the Ediacaran, I found. A lot more people are familiar with something called the Cambrian explosion, which is the period of time immediately following the Ediacaran, which is when we see the representatives of most living things. I want you to pay attention to the differences between these two pictures. I'm going to go back. Notice we have this Ediacaran environment. We don't have anything digging in the sediment. We don't have a lot of evidence that most of these animals would have been moving around or free swimming. Most of them are on these microbial mats. Most of them are attached. We don't see any mouth parts. We don't see any spines. We don't see any shells. We don't see any teeth. Let's go back to the Cambrian period. In the Cambrian, now remember, 100 million years has passed here. But in the Cambrian period, especially by the end of the Cambrian period, we see things like trilobites, which have shells. We see things like worms that are digging in the sediment. We see corals. We see large arthropods large shelled predatory animals. When I say large, I mean like this big, which is big for the Cambrian period, right? But we see animals that have mouths. We see animals that have appendages that would have been able to grab and crush and rip apart other organisms. We start to see the first evidence of violence, essentially, in the fossil record is from the Cambrian. Most of these organisms, well, not actually, that's incorrect. For a long time, we thought almost all these organisms have shells. There are a subset of fossil sites in places like the Burgess Shale, Canada, which I've had the pleasure to visit, and places in China that show actually most of these organisms are soft bodied, but the ones we see in the global fossil record have shells. But we see lots of shells, lots of spikes, and importantly, a lot of digging. Now, digging is very important to all organisms today. The ecosystem around you depends on the fact that there are organisms that dig in the sediment, that remix the sediment, that are decomposing the sediment, and that the decomposed matter gets remixed around, right? That process is essential to how life works today. If you go dig in your garden, dig in your lawn, right, you will find organisms that live down there. And those organisms, things like earthworms, are essential for our ecosystem and the fact that our ecosystem can support so many large organisms. A principal change that we see between the Ediacaran and the Cambrian is organisms are digging. And you can find this in the fossil record. I've actually been, there's a site in Wyoming I've been to that's from the Cambrian period, and it is all burrows. You don't find any body fossils, you don't find any animal bodies, but you find all of these burrows where organisms are digging, probably worms, are digging through the sediment. They're going to, and they're going and they're reworking the earth. And they're building two things. Number one, notice in the Ediacaran on the left, organisms are restricted to this mat above the surface. When you start digging, there's more space. There's more areas for organisms to live. You have more roles that are available to these organisms because they are now digging around. Very important. Additionally, what happens is, number one, we think these microbial mat communities are essentially destroyed by burrowers. That when you have organisms that can dig, they basically dig right through them and they die. They can't survive in these in communities where organisms are burrowing. Unfortunately, is what we think happened essentially. But we think this burrowing is essential for how ecosystems work today because essentially, right, number one, the Ediacaran organisms go extinct. Most of them don't leave any descendants, which is why they look so alien. But we think that this digging, we actually know from living ecosystems, is that these digging organisms allow nutrients to be recycled. They are decomposing dead organisms, dying themselves, being eaten themselves, and it increases the cycling of nutrients through the community. It increases, like in the economy, for example. If everybody just takes all their money and doesn't spend it, the economy's not doing well because nobody's making money because nobody's spending it. So for a good economy, you want people to be spending money, using money, buying things, selling things. The same thing applies, or a similar concept applies to the ecosystem. If organisms are just locking all their nutrients and it doesn't get used, then it's not good. What you need in an ecosystem is lots of organisms that live and die short lives, and their nutrients are constantly being recycled through the system. They're being decomposed and putting back in the system. The nutrients are moving. That's how you create healthy ecosystem. And that's how a lot of the most diverse ecosystems today, places like coral reefs, work that way. So we think that this burrowing is a critical ecological innovation that radically changed the way living things interact with the earth and increase the essentially the foundation available for ecosystems and allow there to be more diversity of life. We also, another innovation we see during this time is something called biomineralization, which is when an organism essentially mineralizes itself, creates a skeleton out of minerals. We are one of those organisms, right? We have an internal skeleton made of bone. It's a mineral, right? But there are other organisms during this time. We don't, the origin of bone is its own question. The origin of bone is probably a little bit after, maybe in the Cambrian, it depends on who you talk to. But there are definitely biomineralizing organisms in the Cambrian. Most of them are what we would call invertebrates, but that is essentially that is a huge innovation that's also happening. And essentially, in the Cambrian, we do not, there's this misconception that the Cambrian explosion is either the origin of life or the origin of animals. Both of those things are not true. Animals existed before the Cambrian, living things existed billions of years before the Cambrian. But the Cambrian explosion is this essentially 13, at least 13 million year period where the fossil record becomes much more full of large multicellular animals with shells that are burrowing and that mostly belong to groups we have today. Most of the organisms in in this picture belong to groups of animals that still exist, or at least phyla of animals that still exist. So you have arthropods, which include things like spiders and insects and harvestmen and lobsters and crabs and things like that. You have corals, which includes corals today. You have chordates, which includes us and other things like that. You have mollusks that include things like bivalves and squid and cuttlefish and octopus, right? And clams and mussels and things like that. So the Cambrian explosion is very important, but it's not also not instant. It happens over at least 13 million years, probably a lot longer, but we're still studying that. So if you're curious, like what is the Cambrian explosion? It's a radical increase in the diversity and number and size of metazoans, of animals and other large organisms over about a 13 million year period. Probably we don't, the chances that there's one cause of the Cambrian explosion is low. It's probably a lot of different things interacting, but biomineralization, the innovation of being able to make a shell from or a shell or a hard part out of minerals is important, and the burrowing of organisms also very important. So this brings us to the rest of the history of life, which is typically what paleontologists focus on, because the Phanerozoic, which is the last 540 million years or so, including the present, is defined by the presence of large organisms, animals, plants, fungi. There are some strange organisms that look like giant plants that are actually some other phylum of organism altogether. I forget what they're called, but they look like a giant mushroom. So, or not a giant mushroom. They look like a giant fungus, essentially, but they're not, strangely. But essentially, the Phanerozoic is just full of large living things, ourselves included. The fossil record after the Cambrian explosion consistently shows that we have, for the last 540 so million years, the Earth system has been full of large, evolving, complex organisms. Our simple organisms still exist and are still doing fine, by the way. Like bacteria still exist throughout this whole time. But this is the major change in life. We have this rich fossil record of animals and plants, tons and literally tons and tons and tons and tons of fossils of plants and animals from this time. So the fossil record gets a lot better, a lot more full of large recognizable animals in the Phanerozoic. We essentially think that all phyla, which is a major division of animals, existed or originated in the Cambrian. We have sponges before the Cambrian, also called porphyrians, very fascinating group of organisms. But most of the living things that we have today probably originated in the Cambrian period. Up until recently, I would have told you that a group called bryozoans or moss animals originated later, but there's been a Nature paper in the last month that actually shows that bryozoans originated in the Cambrian, which I think is cool. So the Phanerozoic is a relatively short period in the history of life. But what we see is this acceleration in the evolution of life. We see more and larger organisms evolving. And once they get started, it's kind of like this avalanche, where in the Archean, we have single celled organisms, we get photosynthesis, we start to get, okay, there's a billion years of photosynthesis, and suddenly we get this great oxygenation event, and we start to get our eukaryotes. And once we get our eukaryotes, they start getting larger, more complex. And then we have that cryogeny and everything freezes, but we still have living things. And we get our eukaryotes are coming together. At some point, we get multicellular animals. And after that, it's just like large animals, biomineralization, burrowing, all these things. And after that, the Phanerozoic is defined by very rapid evolution, and lots of new organisms showing enormous increase in the diversity and abundance of what we call metazoans, which again are these large, basically organisms, animals, plants, fungi. Now, we're not gonna get into too many specifics with the Phanerozoic, but what you should know about the Phanerozoic is that there have been major changes in the types of organisms that exist. We have our Cambrian evolutionary fauna, which is dominated by things like they're called small shelly fossils, like these little shells, and we're not exactly sure what they're from. There's things like trilobites, so essentially those types of organisms. Most of them actually go extinct and are replaced by other organisms, which is called the Paleozoic evolutionary fauna, which goes mostly extinct into mass extinction at the end of the Paleozoic, go figure, and is replaced by organisms that we see today. So the Phanerozoic is, yes, there is this acceleration in the evolution of life and lots of new abundance and diversity, but it is also defined by what we call mass extinction, which are these narrow periods of time where almost all living things, 70%, sometimes 90% or more of living things go extinct all at the same time. So the major transitions in life in the Phanerozoic are really when we have all these groups will evolve, become diverse, usually go extinct and or mostly go extinct or are reduced into mass extinction. Another group of organisms evolves, comes around, mass extinction, same thing. In our modern evolutionary fauna, if we run the clock long enough, I'm sure there will be another mass extinction and some other evolutionary fauna will come along if we were to take this class 500 million years from now. Those are our mass extinctions. So this is just another diagram. And this is, by the way, the best fossil record we have is primarily of large shelled animals. So this graph is basically marine invertebrates, marine shelled animals that we have a good record of. So when we look here, we see the Paleozoic, or our Cambrian fauna is dominated by trilobites. Our Paleozoic fauna is dominated by things like brachiopods, and our modern evolutionary fauna is dominated by things like mollusks. All of these things originate in the Cambrian, but essentially we have waxing and waning diversity, right? Whereas in the Cambrian, we see tons of trilobites. Trilobites are extinct now, but brachiopods and things like gastropods are around in the Cambrian, but their diversity waxes and wanes through time. Brachiopods still exist, but there used to be a lot more of them in the Paleozoic. Gastropods are doing very, very well. They're incredibly successful in our modern oceans. So a couple of other major innovations. The Paleozoic is when we see the expansion of metazoans onto land. Very, very important change. So up until the Silurian period, maybe the Ordovician, but the Silurian, up until about like 400 million years ago, there's no living things on land. All of those living things we're talking about in the Archean and the Proterozoic, those are all in the water, all in the ocean mostly. The expansion of metazoans onto land basically means that we go from occupying about 70% of the Earth's surface to more like 100%. So it's this massive increase in the space available to life. Most of the Earth is covered by oceans, yes, but there's a large chunk of the Earth that is land that is now available to living things. And that includes plants came onto land a lot sooner, or sorry, a lot longer ago than animals did. But things like animals like Ichthyostega and these types of animals are showing this transition of living things from the water to land, which happened in many different groups independently. And I think it's fun to learn about things. If you take a paleontology class from me, we'll talk a lot more about things like Tiktaalik, which is one of the earliest, basically, vertebrates that we think would have been able to walk. Probably did not spend any actual time on land, but again, that is for an actual paleontology course. The Mesozoic period, which again, we're moving closer to the present day. And I apologize, some of this is covered up. Do that real quick. The Mesozoic period, which by the way is not just full of volcanoes like it's sometimes shown, but the Mesozoic is when we start to see a lot of the groups of plants and animals that we have around today. Most of the plants and animals, like if you look out the window here, most of those things did not exist in the Paleozoic. Things like our insects, or sorry, things like bees and insects that interact a lot with flowering plants didn't really exist until the Mesozoic, and that's because flowering plants originated in the Mesozoic. So I look out and I mostly see flowering plants. I think I see one conifer tree back there, but most of the plants you're going to go out and see are flowering. Those show up in the Mesozoic, as do things like large reptiles, things like our pterosaurs here, our mammals, and even our dinosaurs, which includes birds. All of these things show up in the Mesozoic. So most of the groups that we see around today actually show up in the Mesozoic period. And there's plenty of other examples, things like frogs and salamanders and most of the fishes that we have today show up in the Mesozoic. So the Paleozoic is a very alien time, which we would, yeah, if this was our paleo class, we talk more about that. The Cenozoic, the period um, that we are now in, is when we see more like mammals essentially become a much larger physically and much larger component of life on land and in the water. So we have things like elephants and things like rhinos and tigers and things like that showing up. And of course, flowering plants and avian birds, that is our feathered flying friends, become a much larger component of life on Earth. And of course, I should talk about humans, which are, of course, the most important because we're people. As you can see, humans are not that important. But humans are a very, very recent addition to the history of life. Humans did not live alongside dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus Rex, although we do live alongside dinosaurs like your robin or your, what's another bird? Chickens are a type of dinosaur, right? All birds are dinosaurs, not all dinosaurs are birds. But humans are a very, very recent addition, right? Like this younger version of myself. This is before grad school. Uh, put on a few pounds in grad school. But essentially, very, very quickly with human history, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, monkeys did not transform into humans. We all share an evolutionary ancestor with things like apes. And this branch that became humans actually has a lot more diversity than we initially thought. We actually think that now the group that humans are like the last representative of a group of upright walking apes that used to have a lot more diversity, even up until like 10,000 years ago. There were multiple species of the genus Homo that have recently gone extinct. Things like Neanderthals, which, believe it or not, if you are European in descent, you actually have some Neanderthal DNA in your genome. So we would have been closely related enough to Neanderthals to interbreed, which I think is interesting. But this is not a human paleontology class. Suffice it to say, for human evolution, we came around about relatively recently in the last couple million years, Homo sapiens within the last couple 100,000 years. And we're very recent, but we've made a lot of radical changes to the Earth system. And something we should learn from the history of life is that living things can and do influence the Earth system, sometimes in radical ways. So, and we get back, we kind of, to wrap things up, talked about the aims of modern evolutionary biology. It's number one, we want to explain biological phenomena in terms of natural mechanisms. We have learned in this lecture and the lecture before it that living things originated via non-living mechanisms. You don't need to use magic or anything like that. We can explain that living things are the product of natural mechanisms. And when we try to understand living things, we have to put them in the context of their history. So evolution is this change with time, this descent with modification, and we're going to learn in the next couple of lectures how evolution is the result of multiple mechanisms working in tandem. But this lecture is really about this third point, which is that living things can only be understood in the context of their history. So let's wrap up. What did we learn? Like, what are the biggest things about the history of life? Oh, apologize. That lecture, yeah, that animations are messed up there. But let's talk about, because we've spent now like 2 or so hours putting living things into the context of their history. So, what is the history of living thing? Well, what we've learned is that one, life emerged from abiotic chemistry probably about 4 billion years ago. We know that life has a non-living origin on Earth and potentially elsewhere. Probably life exists in other places, but we're not sure. We also learned that life has changed very radically and life has changed the Earth system. It's not just that living things have changed against this unmoving background. Living things influence the Earth and the Earth system in radical ways, the atmosphere especially, but not just the atmosphere, right? Living things dig, living things erode rock, living things release things into the atmosphere. We change the Earth. Whether we like it or not, living things do influence the Earth. And we have to take that into account when we understand their history. And we also learned that multicellular life, the type of life that we are, and the type of life that is represented mostly in this figure that I've shown you many times, took billions of years to emerge. Living things emerged probably 4 billion years ago, maybe more recent, or maybe more recently than that. And multicellular life, larger, more complex life, took even more billions of years to emerge. So we learned something, I think, the most fascinating thing I've learned in putting together this lecture, I would say, is the idea that multicellular life, the jump from a single cell organism to a larger, more complex cell to a multicellular organism, that those steps are more complex and took longer than the origin of life itself. I think that's fascinating because you would think, oh, the origin of life, that must be so hard. Not as difficult, or at least took less time than the origin of multicellular life. Something to think about. And this phenomenon of this abundant multicellular life, when we look around, right, we look outside, you will go for a walk, you'll see there's lots of abundant multicellular life. You'll see people, you'll see birds, you'll see squirrels, you'll see plants, depending on where in the world you live. That is a recent phenomenon, and we should not take that for granted. For most of the Earth history, multicellular life was not the norm. And there's no reason, right? The Earth is not made for us. We are the product of many millions, billions of years of evolution. And the fact that there is abundant multicellular life is not something that is certainly been around forever and is not necessarily permanent. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please leave any questions or constructive criticism in the comments. If you're one of my students, I hope you enjoyed as well. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Doodles.